Today, Inside the Vault, Fred and I break down ways to apply this week's virtue as believers, husbands, fathers, and friends. Whoever you are and wherever you are, we're glad you made it. Are you ready? Let's get back to good. Man, here we go. We're kicking it off. Fred, I feel like you don't need an introduction, but just because maybe there's some slouches who haven't been following along with the fact that you and I are doing a thing now, which is going to be a consistent thing. Give yourself a quick introduction to the listeners and let them know in your own thoughts and from your heart, what's the meaning of this new venture that we're going on together with this series? Like, what has been pressed into Fred for why you're like, yeah, man, let's do this? Because this was a lot of conversation and time between us to think this through. So over to you, man.
Yeah. There's a lot of distractions. There's a lot going on. There's a lot that are causing people to have to rethink, to question. Fear is creeping up in ways now than like never before in people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the focus of what people have been amplifying is all the bad. And I think it's time to get back to the good. And for me, the good has always been centered around my faith. That's what's good. When everything else is wavering, when everything else seems to be unstable, when I can't find the truth, I know what is the truth. And for me, getting focused back on what I know to be true, what has been with me all of my life, keeps me grounded and stable. So this is like the conversation that those of us who are believers know it's the thing to do, but sometimes we need to be reminded. And I hope that what we talk about and how we engage in conversation, man, just helps people to remember to get back to good.
Yeah.
So, yeah, man. How about you?
In the foundational coaching mindset, what my father used to do a lot of, he did some new construction, but he was really gifted at, and the majority of what he worked in was restoration. So building and construction restoration. And I think that is such a huge call for humanity, is to restore yourself back to what is your true purpose and what were you actually made for? Because we get off that beaten path by nature of being born into this world. And that is what we believe is the whole heart of the church, of those who are believers in the faith, is to really shine a light on the purpose that we have, which is to follow Jesus together.
Yeah.
And so we said, man, every talk through every virtue as we get ready to apply it during our application weeks, I just told Fred, like, wouldn't it be cool to just take it back to good and say it's not a moralism approach. Virtues aren't just virtues on their own. Like, they come from somewhere, and they come from, in our minds, and we believe that they come from God. And he puts that capacity and that drive and that desire in our hearts.
Yeah.
And that's the whole purpose to me, is just try to have a conversation that's real and authentic, and that people that, you don't have to be a Christian to sit in and listen on this, but you're going to get real, and you're going to get Josh and Fred, and love it or leave it. It's going to be here, and it's going to happen.
There you go.
So
the unapologetic versions.
Hey, man, you can bet that. But with discernment, I had to do my homework. I'm not going to lie. This is good because it drove me to where I need to go with this. It drove me to prayer and to say, God, like, what are your thoughts on this? Which immediately drives me into God's word, into the Bible, because we're not left to guess. He didn't leave us without instructions. He didn't leave us without care and love. He left us something to be a roadmap and to be a light to the path we should be walking as we try to build this virtuous life. So, man, I'm going to be honest. This is good because it drove me right back to the source where I need to be all day long anyway. Yeah. So I had to go back to that. And I can promise the listeners that this series here will always be rooted in that. It will be rooted not in our own opinions. Of course, we'll have our own assertions and thoughts. That's okay. But I know, Fred, that's why we're doing this. Like, we will root what we do in our faith. Absolutely. And in God's word. So there is no guessing game for us. That is the manual for how we try to lead as men of faith and as husbands and fathers and friends. Yes. So what are your thoughts on discernment? How does that ping around with you?
It's interesting because for a long time that word was only used spiritually with me,
Hmm.
and people would reference it always as a spirit of discernment. Um, I don't think I realized that I was gifted with that or in tune to that until later on in life.
Hmm.
And for me, like discernment within itself, like just definition by the definition, it's just the ability to make wise and to judge wisely. And you don't realize how having wisdom, which I believe again comes from God, is not something that everyone knows how to tap into. And oftentimes when discernment is used, it's not always for you to then either act upon it. Most of the time for me, man, it's for my own knowledge.
Hmm.
It's in a situation, I hate to say it, sometimes about individuals, in knowing how to interact, sometimes being prudent in decisions and engagement. Even for myself, fall into my own trap, right? You have desires and likes, your will, objectives, and then all of a sudden discernment hits, and it's kind of like, wait, something's causing me to pause on this. This is not the best decision. This
Right.
is not what I need to do now, as my wife likes to say. Not never, but just not now. But that's discernment, right? It's it's
Right.
it's the differentiator, I think, that really elevates a person that is in tune to their spiritual power, and for me, that's God. So for me, again, it's not always something for me to say. It's oftentimes something for me to reflect on and to be cautious about. So, what's
Yeah,
your thoughts?
I do have some. Uh, First of all, I'll recommend a book. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. Chris Payne. You know Chris.
Yes.
He's the senior pastor at New City there in Charlotte, and he's the one who buried my dad, married
Yeah.
Laura and me, did the dedication for Karina when we were in Charlotte that you came to. So
Yeah.
just man, such a good brother. But he recommended this book to me. It was a little over a year ago. It was right before we started actually doing like our weekly, bi-weekly
Yeah. Yeah.
discipleship dialogue that turned
Yeah.
into this.
Yes.
And the name of the book is called Pursuing God's Will Together, a discernment practice for leadership groups. And I'll send it to you if you haven't read it yet. But it's by Ruth Haley Barton. And I will share some thoughts on discernment and wisdom. And yeah, much like you did, there's a couple passages that I pulled up that I think are really pointed to even some of the
Yeah.
questions that people asked this week. So a couple listeners asked questions for Jordan and me, and then there were some audiovisual issues that cut out some of our response on her end because her internet was acting weird. And so I won't sidestep those, even though this forum isn't really open to questions. This is more Josh and Fred. I'm still going to
Yeah.
address them because people cared enough to ask, and they
Yeah.
actually do connect with what we're talking. This is really cool. The way that Ruth Haley Barton frames this is through a posture of discerning through prayer. And there are three specific prayers that, man, probably about a year and a half ago, I talked through with Chris, and we were just catching up. And he said, man, this is something I'm going through personally. Discernment was a huge word that he was going through as a leader, as a senior pastor there, decisions that we're making in the staff, vision he was trying to apply. And these prayers are fantastic. So it's the three prayers are a prayer for indifference, prayer for wisdom, and a prayer of quiet trust. And I'm just going to read you a small excerpt from how she phrases this in the book because it is brilliant. It is so well put. So I love smart people because I can just read their stuff and it helps. And I don't have to try and create original thoughts sometimes. So for the in order, so the prayer for indifference, and this is what Chris and I talked, and Chris was like, "Man, I'm going to pray this for you.
Yeah.
I would encourage you to pray these things, and I have. I've been praying these very consistently. I won't lie and say every day because I'm not always that
Yeah.
good, but I've been praying them pretty consistently.
Yeah.
Prayer for indifference, and she says the first and most essential dynamic of discernment is the movement toward indifference, which was referred to in another chapter. In the context of spiritual discernment, indifference is a positive term signifying that I am indifferent to anything but God's will. And so
Mhm.
that prayer looks like God, make me physically indifferent to anything that isn't from you.
Mm,
And I just find that a really interesting way to start discernment because people are always quick to say, let me see this. And that's good. That's also
mhm.
biblical. Like, knock, it's going to be open to you, seek, and you shall find.
Yeah.
I got it. But there's a lot of power in being aware of the things that we need to be tuned off to
Mm,
and saying, I need to be indifferent to things if it's not actually what's best for me according to what I don't even know, what only you know.
yeah.
And the
Yeah.
humility of that prayer of just saying, like, even if I think it's good, I want you to almost make me physically sick towards it if it's not from you. I was like,
Yeah.
man, that's powerful. So that's the first one. Prayer for wisdom is movement toward indifference, is the threshold between two worlds, the world of human decision making and the spiritual practice of discerning the divine will. In this waiting room of the soul, we are made ready to pray the second prayer, the prayer for wisdom. And that comes from James. It says, if any of you is lacking wisdom, ask God who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given you. So she said, in that space is where you can actually pray for that wisdom once you're acknowledging that there are things that you don't need.
Yeah.
And then the last one is a prayer of quiet trust. Another aspect is getting set or getting ourselves in a position to be led by Christ. It's the prayer of quiet trust, like one found in Psalm 131. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. I've calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me. So she says in this prayer, the psalmist, who's David, acknowledges his utter dependence on God in the face of matters that are too great and too marvelous for him, which actually means things that are too complicated and far beyond his ability to figure out himself.
Yeah.
And discernment, I do agree that it's not always a matter of spiritual things, maybe. There are quick ways that anyone can make a discernment or a judgment call or just have a good intuition. But I
Right.
think the true heart of discernment, the way I think of it, that's really been a cool perspective to read what she said. So, hearing that, what are your thoughts on the way she frames that?
I mean, it takes it definitely to a different level because it feels like, and again, this is my first time kind of hearing it
Yeah.
positioned this way, right, in a different definition.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's more on how you see, I don't know about the world, but when you start talking about indifference, trust, and what was the last one?
So there
Wisdom.
was
Wisdom was the second one. Indifference,
indifference, wisdom,
wisdom,
and then trust. Yeah.
and then trust, right? Quiet. Was it quiet trust?
Yep.
What was it? Quiet trust. It's easier said than done. I can tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of those things are challenges and areas which I think anything in life you are constantly trying to get better at it. I think in a time, not to go back to my kind of first statement, but in times like these, I think the indifference one is really interesting because it is very easy to want to take a side or a position on things that I say have nothing to do with because that's not completely true, but are very small in the grand scheme of life and purpose
Right.
that I think could almost say they're trivial,
Mm-hmm.
right? That a lot of people are making deciding factors on. I say deciding meaning to befriend or not to befriend, to isolate and to think less of based off of things that just have no purpose beyond being a point of contention, right? So
Right.
it's interesting because that challenges me a little bit, to be honest, where you have a perspective, you because of life experiences. Yet when you take it back to a spiritual context, as I believe she is saying, there's some things we should not even worry and concern ourselves with. Because if we're really focused on our ultimate purpose and we're really thinking about the things of what Christ um, has put us here for, then that's what our time and energy should be spent around. Yet there's so many things, and I know it's a little different. It'd be interesting. I'm interested, man. Clearly, here in the States, it's a little different because we got a lot of media going on right now, my friend.
Oh
I don't know
man.
how much the great thing about where you are, you really get to refine what you're listening to and what you're tuning into. But it's
Yeah.
it's, it's interesting, and that's just the best word I can use. It's just a lot of viewpoints where it can be distracting. And to back to that first part of indifference, there are definitely some things where I am challenged in really taking a more indifferent position on versus
Mhm.
feeling so passionate or angered, depending on
Right.
the topic, around things that really should not be in my thoughts. It really
Right.
kind of goes back to that verse that talks about think on those things that are good, lovely, just, true,
Hmm.
honest, of good report, right?
Right.
That's the stuff I need to be thinking about versus focusing on what other people are doing, saying, thinking, how they feel, all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
it's a reminder. I think the wisdom one that I definitely align to that one, right? I think
Hmm.
um wisdom is a great thing. It's interesting because I look at it in two perspectives. I think there's wisdom from God that you don't get from experience, but then I
Right.
think there's wisdom that you get from experience.
Yes.
I think both can work together. I don't think they have to be separated. I think wisdom is just, hey, I've experienced some things, I've done some things, I know something different now, or I look at things differently now. But also, there's that, as I like to think of it, a download
Hmm.
that you get from God, like that deposit that isn't necessarily something you've experienced and learned, but all of a sudden you now know
Right.
that gives you an edge up.
Yep.
So that to me is one I think of the three I've tapped into the most.
Right.
I think the quiet trust is an interesting one because I think you know, religious people use the word trust a lot, and you and I both know half of them don't believe it. It's easy to use that word, but your actions will speak much louder than
Yeah.
that.
Amen. Trust in being patient is not a scapegoat for lacking any bias for action or activity. Like you can't
Absolutely.
just twiddle your thumbs and go like, well, I'm just trusting that
Yeah,
Jesus take the
no.
wheel and he's gonna work it out. He's like, yo, you lost your mind.
Waiting on you. Do something. I'm giving
Yeah.
you a brain.
I
So
told
yeah,
you, I
that
told you go.
yeah, right.
I
You
didn't
even done
say,
that.
yeah. I said go into the world. I didn't say sit there and wait for me to tell you the thing I just told you. Get going, man.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. But the
I'm with you.
quiet part brings a new level to it though, right? It's like
Hmm.
maybe isn't always the big stuff, it's sometimes the small things too. And I
Yes.
think we lose it in the small things often, which are the things that eat away at us. And if we really
Yeah.
had quiet trust on a lot of issues, a lot of stuff we really wouldn't be anxious about, which really
Hmm.
gets into worry and fear, right? We can talk about that another time, but that's what all that stuff is.
Yeah.
Which again, which is interesting, right? In the Bible, it talks about constantly avoiding those things. So
Hmm.
our thoughts, what we're talking about now, having the discernment to not think on things that are not of Christ, then helps us to not be anxious and fearful.
Yep.
But oftentimes we don't pull that thread, right? We see them very
Yeah.
separately. We're trying to figure out why are we stressed out? Why are we dealing with all this
And
other kind of stuff?
man,
Health issues.
oh, and I'll tell you what, like if I've learned anything through any sort of academic endeavors I'm doing right now, it really has reminded me about the verse that says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, and all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. And there's some other things I'll share, like specifically that I won't read all of them, but I'll share them and I'll put them in. Like when I put the post, I'll just leave some references for those that are curious to like dive into some really good, I think, contextual verses on discernment and wisdom and the source of that. But as I'm studying things and doing PhD work for a lot of different positions or topics, you can find empirical research that might back almost any stance you want to take based on.
Absolutely.
So, the more I find out, first of all, I genuinely believe the more I realize how unintelligent I actually am, the more I try to learn. And I'm not saying I'm doing poorly in school, I'm doing really well with it, but it just highlights how limited my own knowledge and understanding actually is. And you hear that a lot from people. It's not original to me, man. The more I learn, the more I understand. I have so much
Yeah.
to learn. And that sort of begs the question, like, man, wouldn't it be great if there was a source that just actually could help inform all of these things that I don't understand? And not from
Mm,
a human source that is equally flawed and
yeah.
limited in capacity. So I think as smart as people may sound or want to sound, it doesn't matter. The smartest person is woefully lacking to the source of true knowledge and wisdom. And that's why I love that verse in James that says, if any of you is looking for wisdom, like just ask God. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, he actually wants to hook you up. He wants you to
Yes.
come to him. And I think of that practically because I think it's difficult, even for Christians, but it's difficult for anyone to hear that and
Yeah.
move it from a spiritual theory, which does require faith, it does require
Yep.
belief,
Yep.
into being practical. And I think of it as a father. And
Yeah.
I think being a
Absolutely.
father has shored up my faith so much firmer than it was before. It was such a gift for my own spiritual journey because I think of my beautiful little girls and
Yeah.
even the days where they might just be bugging me to no end, man. And you know what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
Then they can hear this and I'm cool with that. The days where
Yeah.
like, what, first of all, what are you talking about? I
Yeah.
can't follow any of this train of thought. And it's like a gnat in your ear and you love them, but you're just like, man, oh
Yeah.
God, give me patience. Love is
Yeah.
patient and kind. That's the 1-2 punch because it's the hardest. But then when I sit there, I go, but if they came to me
Yeah.
sincerely and said, Dad, and they do,
Yeah.
I drop everything immediately for them because my heart wants what's best for them.
Yeah.
And in those moments, I feel the heart of the Father. I feel the heart of our Heavenly Dad. And he goes, hey, man, if you like to get, and this is biblical, if you like to give good gifts to your kids and you love them so much,
Yeah.
how much more perfect and beautiful is it when you come to
Yeah.
me and you don't even know how much joy it brings me to
Yeah.
give those things to you. And I
Yeah.
think that's just a really quick snapshot in time of the heart of our dad.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
really drives me to almost check myself and be like, man, I forget that so quickly.
Yes.
That the joy that I feel in my heart and the compassion I feel towards my little girls who are
Yeah.
helpless, how much more helpless am I in the eyes
Yeah.
of God?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he literally went to the ends of the earth for us. And
Yeah.
so I think it's a lot more practical than maybe we realize.
Yeah. You know something else too? Even when you were talking about helping and being attentive, I also understand the flip of that in saying, when he doesn't give me an answer, when he doesn't give me what I want, when he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't respond immediately, I understand that as a parent.
Yes.
So there is a level now of understanding that I don't get as frustrated before. Why isn't God answering this prayer? Why isn't he allowing this to happen? Wait a minute. He could be keeping me from something,
Mm,
protecting me. Maybe I'm not ready for it yet,
right.
or it's just developing me. Right?
Right.
It's all the things that we would still do for our children is the same thing he's doing to us.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times we look at it as, why isn't it happening? It's like, well, I remember my daughters many times coming to ask me a question, and I'll say, what do you think? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah.
I'm not going to just tell you the answer, right? You got to figure it out. You got to mature. You got to get off the milk,
Yeah. Exactly. Like
right? That's a
I
part
don't
of it.
want robots that just wait for direction. I want you to
Right.
be
Right.
creatively and critically thinking on your own.
Absolutely.
Like
Absolutely. It's a part
develop
of the
that
development.
little brain of yours.
Yes. Yes.
Oh
Because at
man.
some point, you're not going to be with me.
Right.
And I need to know that you have the ability to assess, make decisions, and know what you're grounded and what you're focused on. So it's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's interesting, man. Again, the parenting thing changes everything. It definitely gives you a whole different relationship. Um, for me, I'll definitely say that. For me with
Yes.
God, for me to my with my kids.
Well, and I think that I have seen you with your kids and we're honest about it too. Like the ups and the downs and everything in between when it turns
Yes.
sideways. But it gives for me, it gives the proper frame
Yeah.
because it's really simple. The instruction to husbands and fathers, if you choose to believe the way that we do.
Yeah.
How do I do that? The same way that Christ loved the church and gave
Yeah.
himself for it.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? It goes far beyond this servant leadership idea in my mind, which there's nothing wrong with that.
Yep.
But that's almost become very cliche. I think is a husband, a dad, a man, it moves beyond servitude and it moves into sacrifice. Like,
Yeah.
what am I willing to actually not just service you? Because sometimes servanthood can also be somewhat self-serving, but
Yeah.
sacrifice holds a different ring in my heart, man.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
different. That has a different punch. And if I'm not sacrificing for my wife and girls, I actually think that I'm wrong. If I'm not finding a way to like die to myself and die to my own desires for their good, it doesn't mean self-deprecating. That doesn't mean I'm just like, throwing ashes on my head all day. Like,
Yeah.
come on. But I do think there's something about that model
Yeah.
of being willing to do that daily at every turn for their growth and for their development and
Yeah.
making those hard choices. And man, it's then when you're asking discernment in those decisions, how do I navigate that? I
Yeah.
cannot do that on my own.
Yeah.
And I think this is there's a verse that says plans fail for a lack of counsel, but in a multitude of counselors, there's safety.
Yeah.
And I think it drives the point home that, like you said, there is discernment that can come from God, but there's also discernment and judgment and decisions that can be made based on the company you keep.
Absolutely.
And
It's huge.
part of what we've been doing, you and me, over the past year plus, and also just as long as we've known each other, you've got to have that in your life.
Yes.
You've got to have not just brothers who agree or maybe sisters who agree with you in the same faith, but also who will challenge you
Yes.
and show those blind spots that go like, yo, that's just a Josh idea. That's actually not. Let me pull this out and show you what it actually says. Cause
Yeah.
hey, you're way off beat there, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
singing a
Yeah,
different
it's
sheet of
funny,
music.
right? That goes back to our topic of discernment.
Right.
Even in the selection of these people who you
Yes.
allow, like call it inner court, whatever you want to call it, to allow to be at a very close place in your life, you gotta have discernment about that, man.
Mm,
Because sometimes it's not the people you think.
right.
Sometimes it's people that you would least likely think you would have alignment with or any type of spiritual connection to. A lot of times we use familiarity or some common in to connect with friends. And
Right.
sometimes guys looking for you to go out the box. Like I have definitely had some relationships with people that they're like, how did we become friends? Like there's nothing about, if you looked at our just exterior, just our lives, how we,
Do you ask Donnie that
care.
every time you hang up the phone with me? How
What
did
was
I
it?
become friends with Josh? Man, every time I talk to this dude, I'm like, how did that happen?
But what I will say, like, you went there. I'm going to go there for a second though. What is great though, Josh, is that there were a group of us that were all
Mhm.
together,
Right.
and you and I have spoken the most. There's a couple of the folks I've spoken to, we speak
Yeah.
to occasionally, but we have kept in touch the
Yes.
most, and we didn't even work out together
Mm-mm.
as much
That was for
as
my
some of the other
own.
folks.
That was for
And
my own
nothing's wrong with
namesake.
that. It's
Yeah.
just
Right.
evolution, right? Time, phase of life.
Well,
You and I are
I
both in the
couldn't. Let's be
same
real.
phases of life.
I couldn't push your weight, so I didn't work out with you. It was for my own pride's sake. So
Oh, get out of here.
let's just be real. I ain't moving what Fred was moving, so I said, let me come on over here with this group. Let me find that dude
Oh,
that's a
get
little
out
bit
of here,
smaller.
man.
But there were a couple questions that were asked for Jordan and me, and
Yeah.
I'm not going to go like one by one. I'm just going to read the three of them because I think in context we can share just thoughts generally speaking, and they were good. So I didn't want to sidestep out of honor for the people that asked them. I don't want them to be like, man, like something happened, he didn't answer it, and I actually took the time to ask because I value people that take time to communicate and
That's
people
fantastic.
that move from consumerism into participation. And I honor always that initiative to be engaged in tough conversations and to be vulnerable enough to ask a question,
Yeah.
regardless of how seemingly small it may be. I
Yeah.
don't know the heart and the context that comes from, and it's not me to avoid that. So I can't. So I'll read them and then, yeah, we can just ping pong them back a little bit.
Yeah.
So the first one says, will you talk about coping mechanisms you used while dealing with tough decisions and how you deal with fear? Man, That could be riddled with some landmines, but that's a good one. I got some thoughts on that one. It says, how do you prioritize acting on discernments you have? Again, another really good one. You're discerning, and then there might be a lot of options that surface. Like, so how do you prioritize? And then the last one was dipped a little bit more existential, but it's a great question. What this is deep. I don't know if I'm the one you should be asking this to. What is the meaning of life if nobody needs you? And man, that's I've sat with that for a couple days. I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm almost glad that the AV had some issues because that's a loaded question, man. But mechanisms of dealing with tough decisions and how you deal with fear, prioritizing discernments you have, and then what is the meaning of life? So you got to go all philosophical.
Let's go with the big boy. Let's just go ahead and hit it.
Let's tackle the big beast first.
I'm just saying, right? If we're gonna do it, let's do it. My word for the year is boldness. So let's just do it.
I love it. What you got?
It's so I look at life, and both of us have had parents who have transitioned.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say, for the first time in my life, because of that experience, I now have a better understanding of what life is really about. And it truly is to complete your purpose and the will of God.
Right.
That's it. That's it. And I have accepted. It's every now and then it's still challenging. I'll just say it, but I have accepted that can come at any stage and any age.
Man,
it doesn't necessarily have to be at an old age. Once you have completed what you are supposed to do, rightfully so, in my opinion, you should transition. That's just it.
Right.
So my thought is, when I hear that type of question, no one needs you, or I think that's where the end of the question was it no one needs you?
What's the meaning of life if nobody needs you? Yes.
Right? Then you should die. Right? That's in my opinion, like that's the natural transition. Once you have finished your part, which I feel we're all interconnected.
Right.
If that statement is true, I mean, again, there's no one else is in need of your gift, your talent, your love. All of those things have been completely exhausted. Then, to me, rightfully so, you should transition.
Right.
That's just being straightforward with it.
Right.
And to be honest, that's what I want for myself.
Right.
Like when I'm done, another guy wrote a book. It was called Die Empty.
Mm-hmm.
And I read, it was like 10 years ago, I read this book. And it was really, really, it was a pivot for me, because first of all, I realized I definitely didn't want to have any regret. So regret was absolutely something. If I think about, I don't like the word resolutions, but as I go into each year, I think about what are those things that I've said, hey, I wish I would have, I need to do this more. I don't want to do that. So if it's in relationships, if it's with opportunities, if it's with whatever it is, I want to just do it. Just especially if it's something like how you said, if it's something that God has impressed in your heart, right? Something that you know is a part of what you were sent here to do. I don't want to delay that anymore.
Right.
So it's like stuff like that. I want to make sure that when my final day comes, I have nothing on my regret list, that I die empty. And to me, that's what this question is really asking, right? If you've done it all and finished it all, there really isn't a need for you to stay on earth, because we believe there's an afterlife. That's just my thought.
That's great. And my thoughts on this one connect to the other question about how I deal with fear, because everyone has fear.
Yeah.
And first thought on that with fear, again, I'm going to do my best to just keep my own opinions out of it, but share what I actually believe. And this is how I've shared it with this friend before who asked the first question. And there's a verse that says, it's in 2 Timothy 1:7. It says, God gave us a spirit, not of fear, power and love and self-control. Some versions might say a sound mind. So first of all, how do I deal with fear? I'm going to come at that question and then backdoor it into the big question. So I'm going to take the other angle than you did. Got to warm myself up, I guess. Not as bold. I'm not as bold as you. That's a lie. But it is sort of related, because I'll be honest, when I heard that question, what's the meaning of life if nobody needs you? I just sense, and I'm not saying this is where it comes from this person, but I've heard questions like that before. And those questions can come from a place of fear.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's where this comes from. So I'm not trying to imply that from this guest who asked. But with fear, I really believe that that's not something that comes from God.
Yeah.
Because if he loves me, much like as the dad, I don't want my girls to see me come into a room and go cower and hide. I want it to be hugs and love and power and self-control and strong minds and bodies and hearts. And God saying, in the most perfect version, that's what I've given you. So when
Yeah.
you feel that, you can automatically know that ain't for me.
Right. Right.
So it's,
Discernment.
yes. And so it really helps me separate the wheat from the chaff sometimes when I'm going like, what am I dealing with here? Well, that's not from a dad that actually cares about me.
Yeah.
Bet money on that. So
Yeah.
that's actually a really simple. It's not really deep, but it's a very simple and crucial first step is to
Right.
appreciate from where is this feeling or emotion or spirit or anxiety or thought, where is it coming from? Because there's a lot of
Yes.
thoughts and a lot of voices that are speaking into us, and these inputs aren't always good. And in the mindset of getting
Most of the
back to
time.
good, all good things come from God. And if he said, I didn't give you that,
Yeah.
it doesn't make it less real of a thing you have to deal with, but you can know
Yeah.
where it doesn't come from.
Yeah.
Bet money on that.
Absolutely.
So then if I'm looking, okay, so how do I deal with that? Personally, I take it to God and I tell him about it. And I also talk to my wife about it, or I'll talk to
Yeah.
people like Fred, or Chris Payne. Like if it's something that's really bothering me and it like has me feeling anxious or worried or afraid about things, I don't let it fester. I don't
Yeah.
isolate that in myself. That is the most caustic and harmful thing I think I could do.
Yeah.
So I actually get it out on the table and I try to tackle it down, not on my own might, but I don't run from it because it's not
Yeah.
going anywhere.
Yeah.
And then what's the meaning of life if nobody needs you? I agree with you. It's one of those things where, first of all, if you're still here, I promise you, everyone is made with a gift. And in the face of fear, because I realize that everyone's dealing with it, I think being discerning on who you surround yourself with, maybe you might not think that they need you or that you bring anything to the table. And this isn't just a feel good thing, but find some people around you who can
Yeah.
actually encourage you. Because that word, encourage, with courage and in a loving way, if someone can, like, get the people that can send you a message
Right.
and also challenge to everybody, like, be that person.
Right.
If you think of someone, it is too easy in today's modern technology to just send a note of
Yeah.
encouragement, thinking of
Yeah.
you, honored
Yeah.
to be your friend, something
Yes.
you don't even know
Yeah.
what that could be pulling someone out of.
Absolutely.
So get over yourself when you have those thoughts, share that encouragement because that is actually in my heart. I believe the most powerful thing is the community that encourages and sees the good in others and tries to take them back to that good.
Yeah.
And it's hard for someone who's surrounded by love, even if you might not be a primary contributor in everything in everyone else's life.
Yeah.
You mean something. So it's worthwhile to tell other people what they mean to you. Because I
Yeah.
think that honest encouragement and gratitude for others saves people from a lot of fear and anxiety. And it actually pulls that question back a little bit of, nobody needs me.
Yeah.
So I think we underestimate the power we can have in someone's heart and in someone's life with a
Yeah.
simple word of encouragement and
Yeah.
kindness and love.
Yeah.
And I'll say to this person, I know who they are. Oh, of course. Um, Man, they're fantastic. And I won't say their name on this because I wouldn't do that to them. But knowing that they have children, and I don't know where this question comes from, and it actually is sort of a moot point to me because I promise you, there is so much that people need from you that they don't even know that they need. The simple life skills, the simple life hacks as a dad. Um, hey man, you know who you are. And you know, like, let's move past existential and just get real for a second. Like, there are so many people that rely on your gifts of just who you are as a person. And without you, they would be very lost. Um, so I think everyone can go through that doubt. Everyone can have those feelings of like,
Yeah.
doubting yourself. And let me just encourage you that can be the further from the truth for who I know you to be. And I think the meaning of your life, I don't know what that is, but I know someone who does. That's a cool person to get to know.
Yeah.
And that journey of exploring that and discerning through those decisions, it's what makes life fun, man. It changes. You grow into that. It's going to shift and mold, and it's always a moving target to me, but there is a purpose there. And that's a fun thing to explore with people who care about you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's some deep questions, man. God, hitting us with haymakers. I tell you what. But what are your yeah, this other question was good. So prioritizing acting on discernments you have. When you're presented with some good questions and opportunities and things are presenting themselves, how do you sift through that?
So it's interesting. I am probably not the best example, but I'll share my truth. Number one is I get in a quiet place.
Hmm.
And that doesn't mean physically in a quiet place. It just means I am not entertaining anyone else's thoughts or ideas.
Yeah.
Typically don't share, especially if I am really dealing with something that I am not clear on.
Hmm.
A decision, to your point, a decision either about family, it could be about career, it could be about relationships with people. I have found that I first need to know for myself um, what I believe the answer should be. And then I look for confirmation. And sometimes that's verbally from other people who
Hmm.
would not know anything about the situation. So back to your point earlier, when you talk about, whoever is looking at life and their purpose and the importance, you never know how, again, the text message, the thinking of you,
Right.
the calling the friend, telling someone hello, complimenting someone could be the confirmation that they are looking for. Who knows what they're dealing with or maybe struggling with when it comes to a decision.
Right.
So that's typically my process is I internalize it with the thought that I'm going to get an answer from God on it.
Hmm.
And then most of the time, I'm just going to be honest again, it's not really the answer that I probably wanted. Especially if it's around something that I really want to do
Yeah.
or something I think looks really, really good.
Hmm.
Um, and then yeah, I typically am, and again, I don't allow the confirmation to become the deciding factor. It's just nice when it happens.
Right.
And again, it will often happen from people and at times that I least expect.
Hmm.
It's not going to come from someone I talk to all the time, usually a stranger. The number of times that people have just walked up to me in random spaces and places and said things that was exactly what I was thinking about, contemplating,
Right.
had a decision that I needed to make, and the answer was there.
Right.
So that's typically how I use discernment and prioritizing and like deciding.
Right.
Doesn't always work, but most of the time, that's kind of my process. How about you?
It's very similar. I try to be very aware and do my best. There are some things that are just a very cut and dry. I need to make a choice.
Yeah, yeah,
But there's actually very little in my life that is so cut and dry.
yeah.
So when those things present themselves, I'm like, oh man, this is a closed ended yes or
Easy.
no. Man, life is so open ended though. Um, I will give you an example. I'm not going to talk in riddles. I'll give you an example because it came to my mind. And I am a big believer that if there's a random thought that is actually about a good thing I've experienced, it's probably not a random
Yeah,
thought. That's probably a God thought. So it might just be worth sharing.
yeah.
So I will try to be bold in that. Let me give an example of how this played out for me. And I think even this example is just laced with the idea of this topic of discernment. So when our oldest Aria, right before she was born, when Laura was pregnant with our uh, 8-year old, I really was trying to be thoughtful about how I would be a dad who would lead spiritually for a little child.
Hmm.
And as simple as this sounds, I spent a lot of time thinking through and praying through with Laura about what are the things that I want to pray for my daughters every night when I tuck them in. Because I think it's very important for us to do like simple devotions together, pray together, let them just see that this is a natural part of who a dad is.
Absolutely.
Like it's caught
Absolutely.
before it's taught. So they need to see me practicing instead of just telling them to do in everything. But as silly as it sounds, I wanted to be careful not to be burdened down with this religiosity of what other people may think parenting should look like.
Yeah.
And I said, man, God, I don't even know what you want and have designed for my kids' life,
Yeah.
what their purpose is. I'm a part of that. That's a gift. That's a blessing. That's a huge task that you've given only to me. So I can't run from it. But I don't want to try to act like I'm God and play God to her. I just need to point her to you.
Right.
And I was, I was back and forth, man. Like, what do I want to pray? Because I've had things prayed is like, and I've heard people pray, and I'm not knocking this. I'm not saying it's wrong. It just wasn't right for me. So please, if you're
Right.
hearing this, take it graciously that I'm not saying you're wrong for each. You're accountable for what you do, and I'm accountable for what I do. And for me, I wasn't going to go in praying like, oh, God, give my daughter, let her marry a godly man. Because I walked that back and I said, who am I to say that marriage isn't God's plan for her?
Absolutely.
And man, I think this is the discernment I'm talking about is even in good intentions, we
Yes.
might unpack things for our children that God never intended for them. And
Absolutely.
then I'm appreciating as the father who they love me and they look up to me. Am I saying things that my dad didn't even tell me to say?
Right.
That was just my desire for them.
Yeah.
And am I putting my hopes into their heart and
Yeah.
not the hope of God?
Yeah.
And I was really challenged with that. And so I'll tell you what I pray. And it's simple because I think it stripped it, it simplified it. It reminds me of Paul, who was a very wise person. And you
Yeah.
know this well. Like, go look up Paul. He wrote so much of the New Testament. Um, if you don't know who he is or you're not familiar with him, like go just Google this guy, the Apostle Paul. And he writes about, he was brilliant. He could have all these debates with the Greek philosophers of the day, be on Mars Hill, all of these things. And he said, my message was simple. I took my own worldly wisdom away and I just simplified it and stripped it down to the message of Christ crucified because that's
Yeah.
where all of the power resides. I didn't need to use fancy words. I just kept my message clean and pure and simple. And I was reading through that because I was leading a Bible study at the time at my church. And that was pressed on my heart for how I prayed for my girls. And so I said, all right, I'm going to pray every night for them that they would love God, love others, and love themselves like Jesus does.
Hmm.
And that they would always seek and obey his will for their lives. And I don't go into long, drawn out prayers with them, but I've consistently prayed that for them when I put them to bed because I want them to hear me say, and I prayed every night for that they would accept him from a young age. So that then
Yeah.
it's a personal choice, but I prayed for their salvation, for their faith. So
Yeah.
those things for their faith from a young age, that they would love God, others themselves like Jesus does, which is the perfect model, and then that they would seek and obey his will for them.
Yeah.
And in those things, I said, I can't really go wrong with that because I'm not painting a picture of what that looks like. I'm just
Yeah.
praying, really, basically, your will be done.
Yeah.
And I talked with Laura and we prayed about it together, and she's like, I think that's great. I said, because I just don't want to put these notions in their minds that later they have to wrestle with, well, dad prayed it for me, so it should be.
Yeah.
And I was really challenged. So as funny as that sounds, that is how I actually, that sounds like such a simple thing. That was the toughest decision is what from day one is going to be the thing that in word and deed I model to my daughter. And man, I don't think there's a weightier choice than some of those things.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's how I went through it. It was a posture of, I don't even know what's best
Yeah.
here. I need your help.
Yeah.
And I sought counsel from trusted friends. I talked with like Chris about that, talked with my brother-in-law, talked with my wife. So there was people that I could speak to. It
Yeah.
wasn't just a
Yeah.
spiritual, mythical thing, but it
Right.
definitely was a posture of like, I think God knows what he needs me to do here. And
Yeah.
then I'm telling you, it's not all about feeling, but there was just a peace inside of me that when that was where it landed through some time,
Yeah. Yeah.
I said, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
So and that's played out in a lot of different scenarios for me, and I've done it poorly too. But that's sort of how I try to navigate those things. Is just be humble enough to realize I don't even know what's going on here, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there you go. There's my response.
No, that's good stuff, dude.
Yeah, as we're applying discernment, man. I'm thankful for brothers like you because
Same, brother.
this is something I can't do on my own.
We're in this together.
Proud of you, my friend.
Taking it back to good.
That's right. See you.
All right, brother.
Bye. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Back to Good. Don't forget to follow Foundational Coaching on your favorite social media platforms. Fred and I are honored to be a part of your story today. We hope this conversation has helped bring your head, hands, and heart back to good.